The Shadow in Room 306. The Black Hollow Inn stood at the edge of town, shrouded in mist. Its towering Victorian structure loomed over the empty street, its windows dark like empty sockets in a skull. Travelers passed it by, and locals never spoke of it. But for Daniel Carter, a freelance journalist in search of his next big story, the inn was a goldmine of mystery. People disappear in that hotel, an old bartender had told him the night before. Room 306 is cursed. If you stay there, you never leave. Daniel had laughed it off. Superstitions and ghost stories, that's what people used to explain things they couldn't understand. But now, standing at the entrance of the Black Hollow Inn, staring at its rotting wooden sign, he wasn't laughing anymore. The check-in. The inside of the inn was worse than the outside. The air was thick with mildew, and the dim yellow lights flickered overhead. The wooden floor creaked under Daniel's boots as he approached the front desk. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, Miss Holloway. Her gray eyes were unblinking, and her hands shook as she slid the guest book toward him. "You want a room, Mr. Carter?" Her voice was hollow, like she had spoken the same words 1,000 times before. "Yes," Daniel replied, pulling out his wallet. "Room 306. Miss Holloway's expression darkened. "You don't want that room." "I do." A heavy silence fell between them. With a reluctant sigh, she pulled out an old brass key. Her fingers trembled as she placed it on the counter. "If you hear it whisper to you, don't answer." Daniel felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Without another word, he took the key and headed upstairs. Room 306. The hallway to room 306 was long and narrow, its walls lined with faded floral wallpaper. The air grew colder the closer he got. At the end of the corridor, there it was, room 306. Its brass numbers were rusted, the wooden door warped like it had been forced open before. Daniel hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he slid the key into the lock and turned it. Click. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The bed was neatly made, the old furniture covered in dust. But something felt wrong. Daniel couldn't explain it. The air was too still, as if something waited in the silence. He stepped inside. And as he closed the door behind him, he swore he heard something whisper his name. As Daniel set his bag down, the unease in his chest grew. The air in room 306 felt thick, heavy, like an unseen weight pressed against his skin. He shook off the feeling and began inspecting the room. The furniture was old and mismatched, a wooden dresser, a single armchair in the corner, and a nightstand with a yellowed lamp. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, revealing darkened wood beneath. But what unsettled him most was the mirror across from the bed. Its surface was foggy and cracked, its ornate frame covered in a layer of dust. It felt like someone had been staring into it for too long. "It's just an old hotel room," Daniel muttered to himself. "Nothing to be scared of." But as the words left his mouth, the lamp on the nightstand flickered. Once. Twice. Then, darkness. The first sign. The entire room was pitch black. Daniel reached for his phone, fumbling with the flashlight. The second the light illuminated the room, his breath caught in his throat. In the mirror, just behind him. A shape. A dark, motionless figure. Daniel whirled around, but there was nothing there. The air was deathly still. He turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. His hands trembled as he grabbed the lamp switch, twisting it desperately. Click. 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 Nothing. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. Then. A whisper. Right against his ear. "Daniel." His heart slammed against his ribs as he spun, shining his flashlight into the dark corners. Nothing. The whisper had been real, he felt the breath of it against his skin. Was someone in here with him? The closet door. Daniel's gaze fell on the closet door. It was slightly ajar. His pulse pounded as he stepped closer. The wooden door was splintered and old, its handle ice-cold beneath his touch. Slowly, he pulled it open. Inside. Empty. Only a few rusted coat hangers dangled from the rod. Relief washed over him. But as he turned away, he noticed something in the mirror again. The closet door was still open, but this time, a shadow stood inside it. Daniel froze. The shadow had no face, no features, just blackness. And it was watching him. Then, it moved. Straight toward him. The light flickered back on. The shadow was gone. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. What the hell was happening in this room? The warning. He didn't sleep that night. The air felt alive, shifting with unseen movements. Every now and then, the lamp flickered, and a whisper would slip through the darkness. Daniel. Leave. By the time dawn broke, Daniel's hands were shaking. Miss Holloway had warned him. But he wasn't leaving, not yet. He had to know the truth about room 306. Even if it meant facing whatever was in here with him. Daniel barely slept. The whispers, the flickering lights, and the shadow in the mirror haunted his thoughts. But he was a journalist, he had come here for the story. By morning, he decided to dig deeper. Miss Holloway was sitting at the front desk, hands folded as if she had been waiting for him. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "The shadow?" She gave a slow nod. "Everyone who stays in room 306 does. But you heard it too." His stomach dropped. "What is it?" Miss Holloway's eyes darkened. "A forgotten guest. The man who never left." She pulled out a dusty, leather-bound book, the hotel's old registry. She flipped through the pages until she stopped at a faded name. Jonathan Reese. "He checked in one night in 1954, she explained. "Alone. Said he needed a quiet place to rest. The staff never saw him leave." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Holloway tapped the page. "The maid found the room empty the next morning. His clothes, his suitcase, even his shoes were still there. But he was gone." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. No one saw him leave. Not a soul. And the shadow? Her hands trembled. "Some say it's him. That he's still in there, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Daniel pressed. She hesitated before whispering. "For someone to take his place." Trapped. Daniel felt uneasy as he walked back to his room. The hallway to room 306 felt different. The air was thicker, heavier. The lights flickered as he reached for his key. Something felt wrong. As soon as he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. He whirled around, but the lock wouldn't budge. The room felt colder. The lamp flickered. The closet door creaked open. A whisper slid through the room. "He's here." Daniel turned slowly. In the mirror. The shadow stood behind him. And this time, it was closer. Watching. Waiting. The shadow moves. Daniel's breath hitched. The shadow in the mirror began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward him. It had no eyes, no mouth, no face. Just blackness, stretching unnaturally tall. Daniel backed away. But the shadow didn't stay in the mirror. It stepped out. Daniel's body froze as the darkness spilled into the room, forming an unnatural shape in front of him. The whisper returned, right against his ear. "Stay." Daniel lunged for the door, but something grabbed his wrist. Cold. Tight. Unrelenting. The room plunged into darkness. Daniel couldn't move. Couldn't scream. He could only hear the voice in the shadows. "It's your turn now." Daniel couldn't move. The shadow's grip tightened around his wrist, cold and suffocating. He could feel it seeping into his skin, a sickening numbness spreading through his arm. The room was pitch black now, so dark that even when he strained his eyes, he saw nothing. No walls. No door. No escape. And then, a voice. Low, distorted, like a whisper dragged through a grave. "No one leaves." Daniel jerked back, or at least, he tried. But the shadow held him in place, pulling him closer. Something was behind him now. Breathing. Then, he felt it. A hand, cold, bony, unnatural, pressed against his back. Then another. Then another. Fingers curled around his throat. The shadow wasn't just one entity. It was many. And they were all around him. The hotel's secret. Daniel thrashed, gasping for breath as the grip on his throat tightened. Then, light. The lamp flickered once, twice, and suddenly, the darkness recoiled, retreating like smoke. Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping. The air felt thick and stale, like he had been somewhere else for hours. Slowly, he crawled toward the door. The handle turned easily. The door swung open. Miss Holloway was standing in the hallway, eyes filled with terror. "You should have left." Daniel shook his head, his voice hoarse. "What is this place?" She hesitated. "This hotel, it feeds on those who stay too long. Room 306 is a door. And once it opens, it doesn't close." Daniel's skin prickled. "Then why don't you shut it down?" Miss Holloway's expression darkened. "Because once you check in," she whispered, "the hotel never lets you leave." The disappearing door. Daniel spun around to look at room 306 one last time. But the door was gone. Just an empty wall where it had been seconds ago. A sickening dread settled in his stomach. Had it been real? Or had he almost disappeared like Jonathan Reese? Miss Holloway placed a cold hand on his shoulder. "You should go now, Daniel. Before the hotel remembers you were here." The shadow's mark. Daniel fled down the stairs, his heart pounding. He didn't stop until he was outside, the cold night air washing over him. He turned back to the hotel. The windows of room 306 were black, empty. But as he stared, he thought he saw something move, a shifting shadow pressed against the glass. Watching him, Daniel stumbled back. His wrist ached. Lifting his sleeve, he froze. Where the shadow had grabbed him, a black handprint was burned into his skin. A mark. A claim. He hadn't escaped at all. The hotel would always know where he was. And one day, when he least expected it, it would call him back. Daniel left Blackwood Hotel that night. He never looked back. Or at least, he tried not to. But the mark on his wrist never faded. No matter how many times he washed, scrubbed, or even burned his skin with a lighter, the black handprint remained, a permanent brand from the thing inside room 306. At first, he thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then, the dreams started. Dark hallways. Flickering lights. A door that didn't exist. And whispers. Always the same voice. "Come back." For weeks, he fought it. But deep down, he knew. It wasn't over. The room that found him. Daniel moved across the country. Changed jobs. Changed his name. But the dreams followed. Every night, he'd wake up somewhere else. A hallway he didn't recognize. A hotel lobby that felt wrong. And the worst part? Every time, he was one door away from room 306. Even in places where it shouldn't exist. One night, he booked a room at a cheap roadside motel, exhausted from days without sleep. When he reached his door, his stomach dropped. Room 306. His hands trembled as he checked the key. It was supposed to be room 108. He stepped back. Turned to leave. But then, the door opened. And the darkness inside breathed. "We never let you go." Dragged back. Daniel ran. Down the hallway. Down the stairs. But no matter how far he went, the hotel never ended. Every door was room 306. Every window showed nothing but blackness. And the whispers were everywhere. "Stay. It's your turn now. We've been waiting." His legs collapsed beneath him. The floorboards rotted away, sinking into pure blackness. Hands, thin, skeletal hands, reached up, grabbing his arms, his legs, his throat. Dragging him back. He screamed. The last thing he saw. The mirror in the room. His reflection was gone. And in its place, the shadow. Watching. Smiling. The new guest. The next morning, a maid entered room 306. The bed was empty. No sign of a guest. But in the mirror, a dark shape stood motionless, pressed against the glass. Waiting. And when the next guest arrived that night, the door locked behind them. And the whisper returned. "It's your turn now."
The Phantom Caller. It started with a phone call. Rachel's phone buzzed against her nightstand at 3:06 a.m. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the caller ID. Unknown number. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. Why did it feel like she had to answer? A strange sense of dread crawled up her spine, but her half-asleep brain pushed it aside. She swiped her finger across the screen and pressed the phone to her ear. Silence. Then, a faint whisper. "Hello?" Rachel mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. The whisper grew louder. "I see you." Rachel sat up, her heart hammering. "Who is this?" The whisper turned into ragged breathing. Then, click. The call ended. The beginning of the nightmare. The next morning, Rachel brushed it off. Probably a prank. But then, the calls continued. Every night, exactly 3:06 a.m. Always from an unknown number. Always the same voice. "I see you. I'm getting closer." By the third night, she stopped answering. But that didn't stop the phone from ringing. On the fifth night, she woke up to find her window open. The lock was still latched. But the cold night air pressed into her room, carrying the scent of something rotten. And when she checked her call history, the number wasn't there. It was as if the calls had never happened. A presence in the dark. Rachel started locking her phone away at night. She turned it off. Put it in a drawer. But still, at 3:06 a.m., she'd wake up to the ringing. Even when her phone was off. Even when she removed the battery. One night, she didn't answer. The ringing stopped. For a brief moment, she felt relief. Until she turned over and nearly screamed. Her phone was on the pillow beside her, screen glowing. The call was still connected. And the whispering was inside the room. Rachel stopped sleeping. She searched for answers online, scrolling through forums about phantom calls and supernatural hauntings. One story made her blood run cold. A woman described the exact same calls. At 3:06 a.m. A whisper. A presence. And then, one night, it spoke her name. 2 days later, she was found dead in her apartment. her phone still clutched in her hand. Call history, empty. Rachel slammed her laptop shut. She needed help. The phone hacker. Desperate, she visited an old college friend, Mike, who was an expert in phone forensics. "If someone's messing with your phone, I'll find out," he promised. That night, she let him keep the phone. At 3:06 a.m., Rachel waited. No ringing. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. Then her house phone rang. The screen showed Mike's number. Relieved, she picked up. "Mike?" Silence. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, "You can't escape me." Click. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. She tried calling Mike back. No answer. She grabbed her keys and drove straight to his apartment. The first death. Rachel pounded on Mike's door. No answer. She tried calling. Straight to voicemail. Finally, she forced the door open. And found his body slumped over the desk. His phone was still in his hand. The screen flashed one final message before going black. "Now I have your number." Rachel backed away, her breath shuddering. She wasn't alone. A shadow loomed in the hallway behind her. And the ringing began again. Rachel ran. She didn't stop until she was back in her apartment, locking every door and window. Her phone lay on the counter. Dark. Silent. But when she picked it up, a call was already in progress. She hadn't answered it. She hadn't even touched it. And yet, the screen read, "Call in progress, 3:06 a.m. Her hand trembled as she brought the phone to her ear. The whisper was right next to her ear. "I'm here." The line went dead. And so did the lights. Rachel stood in the pitch-black apartment, frozen. Then, the TV flickered on. Static. And in the static, a face. Stretched. Hollow. Mouth moving. A single phrase crackled through the speakers. "I see you." Rachel ran. She didn't stop until she reached a motel on the outskirts of town. But when she checked in, her room was number 306. Rachel refused to answer any calls. But the next morning, she woke up with a burning pain on her wrist. She looked down. A number was carved into her skin. 306. That night, she destroyed her phone. She thought she had one. But then, at 3:06 a.m., the motel's landline rang. She ripped the cord from the wall. It kept ringing. Because this time, the ringing wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside her own head. The last call. Rachel screamed, clutching her ears. The sound grew louder. The walls of the motel room darkened, shadows twisting. A figure emerged from the static of the TV. A tall, faceless being, its mouth stretched wide. And then, the ringing stopped. Rachel wasn't there anymore. Her motel room was empty. The only thing left was a phone. Ringing. And when the motel staff finally answered it, there was only a whisper. "You're next." Rachel was never found. But her phone was discovered weeks later, buried in a field. The last call log showed only one entry. 3:06 a.m. Duration, ongoing. No one knows who, or what, was on the other end. But one thing is certain. The calls haven't stopped. They've just moved on. And if your phone ever rings at 3:06 a.m., don't answer. Because the phantom caller already knows your name.